Hello and welcome to the Labor John podcast where let's get right into it because I'm really excited about this next interview. I'm Sam James and I'm joined by my co-host.
I'm Gabe Christie, and we are joined today by Dr. Peter Cole. If you would like to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Peter Cole.
I like it.
So we're here today to talk to you about what I'm assuming is something of a passion of yours, considering you've written 2 books and multiple essays on it, about Ben Fletcher and the IWW Local 8. If you can give a very brief synopsis on what who those folks were.
Yeah, of course. It's my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me on your show. So in the World War I era, the 19-teens and into the 1920s, so for about a decade, in the city of Philadelphia, then the 3rd largest city in the country and maybe the 5th busiest port, the workers who toiled on the waterfront, mostly on the Delaware River side, but some were on the Schuylkill, formed a union of dockworkers or longshoremen. At that time, all the workers were men. And that union was exceptional in many regards. First of all, most workers weren't in unions. Second of all, most unions were comprised of sort of all white, all male, native-born American, that is, men. Often in skilled trades. But by contrast, in this union, the union was incredibly diverse from its inception, maybe about 1/3 Irish and Irish American, 1/3 African American, and 1/3 immigrants from other European countries, especially Eastern and Southern Europe, right? So it was incredibly diverse. And also that union was led by, for much of its history, by an African American born and raised in Philadelphia named Ben Fletcher, right? And so in this era, an era of incredible racism and xenophobia, but also an era in which workers had no legal right to unionize, which is to say that employers had no legal right to respect workers who unionized. They formed a union, right? And that alone would be sort of exceptional, that it was sort of multi-ethnic and multiracial in an incredibly racist and xenophobic era. But they also belonged to a union called the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, whose members were and still are nicknamed Wobblies, right? That union was arguably the most important revolutionary union in the history of the United States, that still exists, still shapes really labor politics in a lot of ways in the US and beyond. And as I learned through my research, and maybe not surprising to the two of you, it's not coincidence that they organized in the IWW. Arguably only a union like the IWW would have been open to organizing such a workforce, with sort of a majority of the members being immigrants and blacks, and with a black leadership, right? And so that union existed for over a decade, or about a decade, and until they were destroyed through a combination of employer and governmental repression. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, in that era, the World War I era, it was arguably the most important interracial union, and maybe even ever before in U.S. history, and maybe prior to the 1930s, when there was a huge increase in the number of American workers who unionized. And Ben Fletcher became the most well-known member of Local 8, and also the most well-known African-American member in the IWW in the United States. Sort of as a perhaps cute way to sort of think about it, I say if you've heard of Fred Hampton, you should know about Ben Fletcher, right? A revolutionary Black man who, as a young adult, helped organize a powerful anti-racist socialist revolutionary institution, but suffered tremendous persecution because of that. Although he was not murdered by the state, he was incarcerated in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary on a 10-year sentence, along with dozens of other Wobblies after World War I. And so Local 8 and Ben Fletcher, who, again, were Philadelphians, right, are incredibly important, right? And I guess we could talk about it more, but it's also worth noting maybe at the jump. Philly has a long history of racism, a long history of xenophobia, and a long history of being an anti-union or anti radical town, right? And so, nevertheless, in this place that supposedly is not very hospitable, flourished this really powerful, important union for a decade or so.
I was a wobbly for a spell, a little bit before we started the podcast.
In proud wobbly traditions, you stopped paying your dues. So,
even in the so-called heyday of the IWW, 1905 is when it was founded in Chicago, which is where I speak to you from today. Into the mid-1920s, there was upwards of 100,000, 150,000 members maybe at one time. But historians guesstimate that there might have been 10 times that number who might have cycled through the IWW, joined, paid dues, and dropped out. For any number of reasons. One being actually it was easy to do. A lot of workers were migratory. And the dues were low. And so although that kept it open to people, it didn't give you an incentive perhaps to keep them up, because there was, by constitutional, they sort of kept initiation and member dues low, right? Because they didn't want to exclude anyone, right? But most unions actually often have very high dues and assessments, including to join, and you're not allowed to transfer between locals even in the same union, right? And so you might have an incentive to stay and to keep up paying your dues, right? But yes, in modern times too, a lot of people have joined the IWW and then stopped, even if they might continue to believe in many of the ideals of the IWW, maybe joining other unions. But many people, as you two probably know, in the IWW are dual carders, right? Which means that they might be a member of a traditional labor union, like, I don't know, the carpenters or the teachers, but also for ideological reasons continue to be loyal to the IWW and contribute to their organization, today.
So I want to ask, what got you personally interested in the story of Fletcher and Local 8?
Yeah, so I graduated college in 1991 and then went to graduate school to get a PhD in history. If anyone's listening and actually listens to my advice, do not go straight from college to graduate school. Although I did, and it worked out okay for me, but generally, I think it's wise to take some time. I was straight in. I was at Georgetown in Washington, D.C., which is just 2 hours away from Philadelphia by car or bus or train. I was really interested, like many young people, with civil rights. That movement really sort of was the defining one of the late 20th century in America, and going to school in the 80s and having professors who were influential at my college at Columbia in New York City. I was really interested in that. And civil rights movement is one example of a social movement being when people organize together collectively to achieve some collective goal, right? Like that they might not be able to achieve individually. So I believe civil rights was really interesting, and I thought I might want to study that. When I was in graduate school, I came to appreciate, thanks to professors I had at Georgetown, including someone named Dorothy Brown, right, that industrialization and the labor movement was also very fascinating to me. And for me, the basic question was, even in the early 90s, that the single greatest social movement arguably is the labor movement, because it does is it redistributes wealth downward, right? And so if you believe that actually the economic system is unjust, and it's easy to believe that when a handful of people are billionaires and billions of people have zero wealth, then you might ask, how do you change that, right? And so there's many different possibilities, and I don't know if there's a single answer. But one way, actually, that has historically proven to be effective, partially at least, is collective unions, right? Unions demanding greater wages from the bosses, right? And so keeping in mind that the labor movement was really interesting to me, the civil rights movement was really interesting to me, I combine those, as many people have, because you can't really separate out these identities. If in the United States, the great paradox is it's a country that was founded on and preaches the ideals of equality, yet has not achieved that from its inception onward, right? Even if it might have improved over time, right? And so here we have a society that preaches equality, that practices inequality based on race, sex, and many other ways. And so I was interested, therefore, in this whole so-called race-class question, right? Not which is more important. I think that's a bogus question and a false avenue to explore, right? Both are obviously important and both obviously impact each other, right? But I was interested in looking at the labor movement where it was able to be interracial and multi-ethnic in a country where actually historically many, maybe most unions were not inclusive. Right. And so I was in graduate school, like other grad students, thinking, what the hell might I do? Can I find an interracial union to write my dissertation about? The truth is, there's very few before the 1930s, right? And I was in a graduate class on the 1920s and 30s. And I read about the industrial workers of the world. I was 24 years old about when I first learned about the IWW. It's not taught, right? Like they are not taught. And even in history classes in college, perhaps. And so I was astounded by this union. The book was Melvin Dubofsky's classic, We Shall Be All, a survey of the IWW that was written in the late 60s. And although it's imperfect in a number of ways, it's really sort of still a go-to book, I think. And there was just a few lines, literally just a few lines about Ben Fletcher and Local 8. And I was like, who the hell is Ben Fletcher? What the hell is this union? And I investigated a little further and learned that about two other people had written a few other words about this group. And I thought, well, this might be actually not only interesting and important, but for better or worse, for a dissertation, something that's original in some way, and i.e. that someone has not written about it. And so I started to dig, right? And I started to do research trips to Philadelphia in the mid-90s. And I learned, A, that actually this union was really interesting and important, including Ben Fletcher, but not only him. But B, that actually there was enough information with enough work that one could potentially write something in depth, right? And ultimately that became my dissertation. And then that became my first book, Wobblies on the Waterfront, as well as my second book, which focused on the life of Ben Fletcher. Yeah. And so that was the sort of journey, right, for me. But it's a journey, I think that, really sort of it's about like trying to find out why it is also, right, that no one actually has cared enough about that topic that I think actually is fascinating and important, right? Like that might be a reflection on the state of the historical scholarly field, but also more broadly, the ignorance of Americans about our history of radicalism and especially our working class history. Utah Phillips, the former Wobbly, late Wobbly and folk singer, always said, like, we learn the history of the ruling class, right? Like that's what we're taught in school, right? We're not taught our history. Right now, Howard Zinn, of course, called that the people's history, and that's another great phrase one might use. But whether you call it the people's history or, the history of the working class, we aren't taught it, right?
No.
And so therefore, there's still lots of gaps in our knowledge about incredible people and institutions that existed previously.
So can you give a little backstory on Fletcher himself and then kind of how Local 8 came to be?
Yeah, of course. So Ben Fletcher, born in 1890 in Philadelphia. His parents had moved to Philadelphia in the 1880s. They had moved his father from the eastern shore of Virginia, which was traditionally a very maritime-based locale, fisher folk, boatmen, etc., sailors. Mother, actually, I don't think it's clear, Virginia or Maryland, but sort of the upper South. At that time, this is before, quote unquote, Jim Crow existed, right? But it is after Reconstruction had been defeated. And so it's a transitionary time with rising racial violence and the rolling back of racial equality as much as it had existed in the 1870s and 60s. So, like, why did his parents leave? We don't know, but we could guess, right, that they believed that the conditions in Virginia were worse than they might be in Philadelphia, which was at that time the largest city outside of the South in terms of its African-American population, and also not far away. We also don't even know if his parents were born enslaved, although since they were born in the 1850s, it's reasonable to conclude they were.
Yeah.
But we don't know. And Fletcher sadly never even mentioned that, at least nothing in the records that we have right now. But Fletcher was born in 1890. His name's Benjamin Harrison Fletcher. Benjamin Harrison was the president at the time, and he was a Republican president. And it was not uncommon then or now for people to name their children after people they thought were great, right? And 99% of African Americans were Republicans at that time because it was the party of Lincoln, right? Like, and so we could guess, right, that his parents were typical, actually, of African Americans in that era. They moved into the city of Philadelphia, although they moved around. They were renters. They weren't rich people. We don't know actually what sort of work they did. His mother died actually when he was about 15 or earlier. He had several brothers and a sister. They lived also in Camden a little, but mostly in Philadelphia. And were day laborers, right? There were very few jobs open to African Americans in the city of Philadelphia, despite regardless of what skills they might have. Ron DeSantis might tell us that slavery resulted in great skill training for African Americans, including blacksmithing. Well, if they moved outside of the South, and even after the Civil War in the South, essentially skilled labor was increasingly denied African American men. Women had even fewer opportunities, and the majority of Black women who worked outside of the home worked as domestics. And so there are a few opportunities. Fletcher didn't graduate high school. We don't even know if he graduated primary school, which would have been 8th grade, although he's very intelligent. He's very... he has a great command of the English language, both written and spoken. There were, of course, many intelligent people who didn't have much formal education, and we call them autodidacts. And there's a long history in the working class of highly educated, self-taught, right, people. Fletcher probably fits into that category, right? He probably was looking for work. And probably worked again as a day laborer, maybe on the docks for part of his time, maybe on construction sites, and joined around the age of 18 the IWW and the Socialist Party. Why? Well, we can surmise it based on what he later came to advocate for, but he never documented why he joined those two institutions around the same time. At that time, around 1910, it was common for people to be both in the IWW and the Socialist Party. Eugene Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party, was in fact a founder of the IWW, and many other Wobblies. A lot of socialists saw the IWW as the working class or the union arm of the Socialist Party. But Fletcher dropped out of the Socialist Party not long after. We don't know why, but there was actually a big rift when the IWW became increasingly anti-electoral. And the Socialist Party was about electing people to office, right?
Yeah.
And so there was that split that still exists between anti-capitalists over the path towards socialism, right? And Fletcher really, I wouldn't call Fletcher an anarchist, although there were anarchists in the IWW, but he definitely was anti-electoral, right? There's a letter in my book on him in which it talks about someone going, if you want to vote, vote, but good luck with that, right? And so does that make him an anarchist? Maybe, but he had zero confidence, right, that that was typical of the IWW, right, because the ruling class controls basically the sort of the levers of political power, right? So to the courts, right? And so the only path to actually radical change would be working class power, which would be at the workplace. That was very much the Wobbly view of things. That was sometimes called syndicalism or anarcho-syndicalism. I think either of those terms apply, although it's confusing because in other languages, in the Romance language world, syndicalism, right, means just unionism, right? But nevertheless, right, he might have been called a syndicalist by someone who wants to be specific. Right?
Yeah.
Even before Local 8 was formed, he was a leader in IWW in Philadelphia. He's documented as being a very good speaker in Philly, but also downriver in Chester, where African Americans also lived, and downriver, down the Delaware River, that is, right? So we know that he was rising, right, as a leader, organizing. And I would also just note that the IWW was heavily white and immigrant, right? He would have been one of the few African Americans in the IWW in Philadelphia, right? But that he was acknowledged as a leader and praised already tells us a little about the anti-racist bona fides, right, of other members of the IWW, right? As well as the fact that he had experience organizing in a majority white workforce, right? Which is interesting and important because the docks are also majority white, right? Although there were a large number of African Americans, they weren't the majority, right? It's also interesting that, of course, the majority white workforce would be open to being led by a black man in an era,
Yeah, right.
where that was rare is actually an understatement. Right, and so what we've got is this fascinating milieu, right? The Wobblies also organized textile workers, which was, as you know, the largest industry in the city in that era. Organized among metal workers, the IWW did, which was one of the other large industries in Greater Philadelphia in that era, but didn't yet organize the Waterfront. Right, Ben Fletcher was a part of the organizing of the Waterfront in 1913.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the almost race between the IWW and the ILA to organize in Philly?
Of course, that's really important. So the mainstream longshore union in the country was called the International Longshoremen's Association. They still exist, the ILA, and they were members of the American Federation of Labor, which was the largest conglomeration of unions who were largely craft unions, largely skilled workers. The ILA was sort of interesting in that it did include African Americans, although often in segregated locals and often sort of not given full equality within locals from Boston down the coast and around the Gulf of Mexico. The ILA had organized most every port in the country of consequence. By 1913, Philadelphia was the largest port in the country that had not yet unionized. There had actually been attempts to unionize in previous eras, including the 1890s, right? And those had failed. And so the ILA, we don't actually know. We, in this case, it might be I, right? Keeping in mind that Dockworkers go on strike in May of 1913, 4,000. They shut down the port for 2 weeks. The IWW officially doesn't yet have a charter of dockworkers. It's during the strike that a charter that is issued as Local 8 of the Marine Transport Workers component of the IWW is issued, right? And we also don't see Fletcher taking at least a public stand according to the recorded documents that we have, which are the IWW press and the local Philly newspapers, right? He's not mentioned. Other leaders are, right? And so is Fletcher not named because he's not important? Maybe. Is he not named because he's the only significant African-American presence and they don't want to sort of imply that? Maybe.
Yeah, that's what I was going for.
There's a lot of unknowns, sadly, right? So we know that Local 8 emerges. We know that actually in that era, workers often struck for union recognition, right? Because again, it's not until 1935 workers have the legal right to unionize, which means that you could unionize. It's just that employers could fire you and they had no legal consequences if they did, right? And so it was common that the first strike was a recognition strike and for often wage increases and other things, right? And that was the case in May of 1913, which was victorious. They got the employers to negotiate with a committee elected by the strikers. That committee was multiracial, right? And that was also sort of I don't want to say it was created by the IWW, but the IWW, interestingly, including in Lawrence the year before in 1912's Red and Roses strike in Massachusetts, right, where their committee of negotiators and strike leaders, that they essentially mandated that members of every ethnic group had a representative on the committee, right? That was the case in the Philadelphia longshore strike of May 1913, right? It's possible that Fletcher was on that committee, although we don't even know the names of the committee, right? The IWW papers, and I could guess they did not take great records, were confiscated by the federal government in 1917 and subsequently destroyed. So we also lost whatever records might have existed locally, right? It's a shame, and that's nationwide, right? That the federal government confiscated after raiding dozens of IWW offices and destroyed sometime in the 1920s, probably, most of those materials. But they didn't legally have to keep them. It wasn't until the 1930s that the National Archives was created, right? So that the federal government also didn't have to keep stuff legally up until that time, right? So despite what we don't know, we do know the outcome, right? The strike was victorious, which meant that the employers up and down the Delaware River would negotiate with this union that they granted raises, and also that then the union, another of their victories was ending the shape up, right, which was this exploitative hiring system that was hated by dock workers. It's also used in other day labor or casual labor as a hiring method. Sometimes it was referred to as a slave market, right, because basically hundreds might show up for dozens of jobs, and the hiring boss just picks and chooses. There's a famous scene in On the Waterfront where they show a shape up, right? And basically it's a very effective tactic to divide and conquer workers, right? And drive down wages, right? So the shape was ended, which is actually a huge victory, right? And we also know that soon after, the IWW Local 8 Hall, which was ultimately at 121 Catherine Street, there's still a house at 121 Catherine, but it was torn down in the 90s, the older building, and now there's a building there, but it's a rich individual person's house, as opposed to and that neighborhood is different, I think, than it used to be too. But basically employers would call up the union, and workers would be dispatched by the union to different piers, and that the union started dispatching multiracial gangs, right? Integrated gangs, which is to say. But it's also crucial to note that before 1913's victory, gangs were segregated by ethnicity and race. So there'd be a Polish gang, an Irish gang, a black gang, an Italian gang, and often they were played against each other in another way that divisions would be sown among the workers, right? And so I say 51 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 legally abolished segregation in the United States of America. Local 8 did it without asking anyone's permission.
Wow.
They just did it, right? And at that time, almost all jobs were segregated by race and gender, right? Not legally, but it was just a norm that employers did, that few workers and few unions challenged. Right? Mm-hmm. And so those are sort of a victory in terms of wages, but also ending the shape, but also then this other qualitative victory, right, which is, so non-economic, right, but nevertheless vital, right, sort of if you believe in equality, and the IWW's began its existence because it was committed to doing what the AFL did not do, which was to unite all workers regardless of craft, race, color, or sex, or nation, right? And so those are immediate gains that happen in the spring and summer of 1913, right? And we do see Fletcher starting to become the more public face in this era as well. And that he's also sort of known nationally, right? And so the IWW newspaper, and he attends the national convention, for example, of the IWW in Chicago, and is acknowledged as such as a unusual figure, as one of the few African-American leaders in the IWW in that era.
Thank you. And I actually hadn't put two and two together in my head until just now, but because the federal government didn't technically segregate its workforce until 1913. So at the same time, the Wobblies were desegregating everything, the federal government was segregating itself for the first time officially.
Yeah, that's a great point. So under President Woodrow Wilson, who was a Democrat and a noted segregationist born and raised in Virginia, that the federal government started to segregate itself, in Washington, D.C., which is a southern city, also was segregated, but that the feds, which had been a Republican-dominated national government really since the 1860s, that started to change, right? And so Wilson ushered in segregation. So actually, Gabe, that's a great point you make, that at the time that Local 8's fighting for this, the federal government is doing that.
This might seem a little bit off topic, but I've always been kind of obsessed with union dues buttons. And can you talk a little bit about their importance for job control for Local 8?
This is the only reason why Gabe brought you on.
It's true.
Yeah, so it was actually thanks to some Philly Wobblies, who are no longer Wobblies, sort of started to share with me the fact that there was these buttons, right, and that on eBay and other sites, right, that some people collect these things, and that there's even Local 8 buttons in circulation, right, including, for prices that are somewhat high or insultingly high, but maybe that's normal for collectors. So Local 8 would issue, we don't know when they began to do this, but it's very probably very early, and they were hardly the only, lots of unions issued buttons, right? And they might issue a new button each month if you've paid your dues, right? And if you have a workforce of 4,000 or 5,000 people, you can't know everybody, right? And so the button also is a signal to fellow workers, right? Who's in the union and who isn't, and who's up to date and who isn't, right? And so the IWW was and is sort of a very sort of horizontal organization without a lot of paid elected leaders. And what that means, and that's intentional, is that ordinary members of the union have to organize, as opposed to leaving it to the elected local president or business agent, et cetera. And so, say you're hired on the docks, right? And there's 100 guys, again, all male workforce, and there's 5 gangs of 20, right? And you look around and you see who's wearing their buttons. Everyone would have worn their buttons, right, on their hat or on their coat, right? And if you see someone who's not wearing the button, you know that they're not actually a loyal member, right? Mm-hmm. What are you going to do about it? Well, there are some documented cases, or at least oral histories, in which Local 8 members said, well, what would happen is that we would go to the bosses who was working that ship and say, you got to knock off those workers and hire Local 8 members. And if the employer said, fuck you, right, or ignored their requests, they might just sort of in the middle of a shift walk off the job. Or as Abe Moses said, we'd pull the cargo slings up, right? Cut the rope so that you'd have cargo hanging, right, from a ship, right, above it, or maybe aboard the sort of the dock, and walk off the job and say, well, they basically called what, among other terms, you might call a quick strike, right? Some term also might be described as direct action, right? And so they would, this would be undeclared, this would have been spontaneous, which would have been sort of organized by the workers on that particular work site, right? Not from above, right? And we have no idea how many such strikes occurred or did not occur, right? Might be easy to think hundreds occurred. I actually do over the course of a decade, but we don't really know how rare or uncommon. Of course, the threat of it might be sufficient to keep employers in line, which is to say hire only Wobblies, right? And we know even during World War I, when the federal government and many institutions, including the rival AFL, were attacking the IWW, employers continued to hire Wobbly only in Philadelphia, right? Which suggests that they had the power. It's also worth noting. Yeah. They don't sign contracts, right? At that time, the IWW refused to sign contracts because they believed it would limit their ability to strike. And they believed that the strike was not only the most powerful weapon workers have, but also the path towards revolution. Ultimately, there would be some one big strike that would be the transition, right?
Yeah, they're very big on the one big blank.
Right, one big union. We should all join, and the one big strike, right? And so... So, when they hired, that is employers, right? They were under no legal obligation because the Wobblies refused to sign legal contracts, right? They were oral agreements that generally lasted for a year. But ultimately what that means is that either side could void that contract if they thought they had the power to do so.
So on that note, what kind of larger job actions did Local 8 get up to?
Yeah, so Local 8 went on strike in its entirety on a number of occasions from 1913 to 22, I should know maybe, but at least 6 major strikes, right? 1913, well, I think there was one in 1916. 1920, of course, was the biggest, close to 10,000 workers. 1922, smaller strikes in there too. They also struck, as you may know, Gabe and Sam, because they struck on their birthday, right? And so on their first anniversary of their founding strike, right, they had announced that they were going to take the day off and celebrate their birthday with march and parade and picnic, right, with speakers, right? And employers said, "What are you talking about? It's a day of work. If you don't come to work, you don't come to work tomorrow, right?" But nevertheless, according to the record, Local 8 went on strike that day, marched through South Philly, marched to a park and celebrated themselves. And, nothing happened to them because they were able to shut down the port for a day, basically, right? Like, and they would subsequently, in future years, 1915, 16, they 1917, well, the war had just begun, so they actually suspended their birthday strike. So for a number of years, they struck. You might call that a symbolic strike, although one day off, right, is better than no days off. But so they periodically engage in strikes, generally for wage increases, but also to try to extend their power to other maritime workers along the Delaware River, right, to other port piers, to the sugar refinery workers, which was also dockside work, unrefined sugar coming up from Cuba and the Caribbean to be refined and then distributed for consumption in Philly, but also in other coastal cities, as that would have been the norm then, as well as to bargemen and others who work along the river. And they often sort of were... they didn't demand different wages for different types of work. They always demanded equal wages for all work, which was also atypical and then and now for workers. So they struck on a number of occasions. They also struck in 1920, of course, for the 8-hour day, right, which was one of the big demands of workers in that era, without success. But when they struck for the 8-hour day, they just basically said, we're going to start reporting for work at 9 a.m., not 8 a.m. We're going to reduce from 9 to 8 hours. And employers are like, that's not the way it works. Yeah. And so in 1920, there was a huge wave of strikes from 1919, 20, 21 in industries across the United States and world, right? And so Philly went on strike too. Like most of those strikes in the United States, it was not successful.
That's the one reason I have a soft spot for the Wobblies is because they're always so direct. It's we're going to have off on our birthday. No, that's it. That's it.
The Wobblies then commanded tremendous respect even from those who disagreed with them, or at least from some of those, because I used the phrase true believers, right? Like, because, they wanted to earn more money and work fewer hours. What person doesn't? But they didn't just want that, right? And so in contrast to the AFL, which basically just wants a bigger pie, right? Like the IWW wants the whole pie, but also, and there's short and long-term goals, right? Like, but they were committed. If you've never seen the documentary The Wobblies, which was restored and originally in 1979, there's a Philadelphia African-American longshoreman named James Fair who's interviewed in it. It's an incredible film interviewing elder Wobblies talking about their deep commitment to their beloved union.
Yeah, it's every Wobbly story I've ever heard has always just been very inspiring. And especially the stories of workers like coming together the night before something saying, we don't like this, we're going to fix it in the morning, going in and just walking off the job.
Yeah. And then they have a picnic or a baseball game.
Right. So I too am captivated by much of the passion and organizing and commitment of the IWW. It's also worth noting that the failures, right, like that the IWW has never achieved what it's wanted. Of course, no leftist institution in the United States has, right, or in most countries. But like, it was often criticized for not being well organized, right? Like that they would strike, but then famously, after the incredible victory at Lawrence in 1912, right, within a year, basically the Wobblies had lost control of that, right? And so local aid is interesting because it combines a lot of the sort of the excitement and passion and perhaps attraction of the IWW, but also was durable, right? Was able to represent workers for 9 years. And that is highly unusual in the IWW. A lot of people were members, but that didn't necessarily, they would often have short-term gains that would dissipate, right? Like, and as anyone knows who organizes, whether it's a church or a baseball club or a radical organization, right? It's, year after year, right? Like doing the work, right? Like, and that is the nature of organizing, but it's the less sexy part, right? And local aid is an example of that. The IW could do that, right? It wasn't the only place where they had long-term but it was the only place where they had a long-term multiracial union, right? That was black-led, right? So, there's a reason that the IWW declined, and although government and employer persecution was central to that, it's also one must be critical of oneself and see what are the things that could be better, right, and more effective. And the IWW definitely could be better, in my opinion, in that era. And maybe since I'm not a member of the IWW, but it's a very small organization, and that tells us something, right? It's that apparently it's unable to attract more people, right? If you want revolution, you can't just have a few people, right? Although Lenin, as the vanguard party, I mean, that was a different strategy towards revolution, right? I love the Wobblies. I'm also mindful that they're far from perfect. It's also worth talking about briefly, or me highlighting, the IWW was global, right? It did organize in dozens of countries. Right? In that era, sailors and migratory workers who would bring the ideas and the passion and the institution to Mexico and Canada, to Chile and other parts of South America, right, to Australia and New Zealand, right, across the Atlantic into Western Europe, right, into the South Atlantic and into Southern Africa, and other places, and that the industrial workers of the world name really meant something. They believed capitalism was a global problem, and therefore the solution had to be a global union, right? And it wasn't just a global union. It was a global anti-racist union, right? And so the first union in Southern Africa to organize Africans, black workers, were the IWW, right? The first union in New Zealand to organize indigenous workers was the IWW, right? In a number of places, the IWW organized workers. In Canada, right, organized indigenous people, and so. That's also impressive, right? That they brought this anti-racist, a term that wasn't used then, but now we use, right? Commitment, right? Which was very unusual because actually there were people who identified as socialist in that era who were racists, right? Australia and South Africa and Britain had these sorts of white labor socialists, right? Which seems like a contradiction, but nevertheless existed, right? But the IWW castigated that notion and organized differently.
And on the topic of criticizing the IWW, can you elaborate on the Philadelphia controversy?
So it's complicated because it involves really two separate issues that came to coexist. Right. So in 1920, just shortly after World War I, but also shortly after the Soviet Revolution, and in the midst of what was then a civil war, because anti-Soviets, the so-called whites, were fighting the Reds, right, in the Soviet Union, and everyone on the left loved the Soviet Union at that time, right, including Wobblies, right, because it has the first successful socialist revolution, right. Local 8 members were accused of loading weapons for the whites. Now, the U.S. government supported the anti-Soviet opposition, right, and did provide arms as well as some troops, but in Siberia, which is you would get to the United States to Siberia from the Pacific coast, not the Atlantic coast, right? And so it's documented that radical longshoremen in Seattle found weapons and refused to work them in 1919. Right. So there was an accusation that Local 8 members loaded weapons for the whites. Right. It's possible that happened. We don't really know. We know that there was an accusation leveled from people in New York City, not so far away, but where they said these are traitors of the class, of the working class, right? And therefore should be purged, i.e., expelled or at least suspended from the IWW. And that quickly happened. Right. We also know actually that a lot of Wobblies joined the Communist Party, right, which was nascent or in its infancy at that time. And we also know that the Soviet Union and communist parties across the world were trying to basically increase their numbers by appealing to other leftists, right, and that the IWW and other more anarchistic unions flirted with the the Soviet Union, attended conferences in Europe where these things were discussed, right? Like both in Moscow, but also in Berlin, right? Like, and we know that the IWW and some other more anarchist unions rejected ultimately affiliation, right? And so Ben Fletcher argued, and I tend to agree, that this was a false charge in order to disrupt a rival, right? And if you couldn't basically co-opt and bring in Local 8 and the Marine Transport Workers, which was one of the stronger arms of the IWW, the sailors and dock workers, that you would destroy them. This tactic, of course, is not the first or the last time the communists engaged in it against left rivals. Those who know the Spanish Civil War, right, or read George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia could read about it in 1936-37 Barcelona, right? Like, so is that actually what happened? We don't know if Ben Fletcher is true either, right? Like, I don't know. Although we do know that a lot of members of that New York City Marine Transport Worker Local later affiliated with the communists, right? Like, and so I'm inclined to believe Fletcher, and that Fletcher and others in Local 8 said we didn't load these weapons, but if we did, we didn't know it was going to the whites. We've loaded lots of weapons before, right? So then they were sort of going to be integrated into the IWW, but then the Local 8 also had instituted a higher initiation and dues fee that was more in the keeping of the AFL and violated the IWW Constitution, right? And the Local 8 basically said, during the war, there was this huge influx of workers, black and white, and there's now all these sort of surplus workers, and we can't control the waterfront if we can't control who's in the union, right? Now, this is a short-term logical argument, but it is a contradiction to both the IWW Constitution, but also the goal of revolution and forming a revolutionary union, right? And so then they were sort of resuspended. Now, at that time, the IWW was bleeding. Its top leadership, including Ben Fletcher, were in prison, right? Many of its locals have been destroyed. And Local 8 was among the strongest and largest locals in the country. And losing it was important and unfortunate, whatever one thinks about the politics of the controversy, right? Like, ultimately, Local 8 agreed to lower its fees after arguing that the dues is a separate matter from revolution, and that we're the ones who basically are the most effective union local in the entire IWW. So watch us instead of reject us. Mm-hmm. So again, one can have different interpretations of that, but like after about a year, the Philadelphia controversy ended when Local 8 promised never to load weapons to the whites or anyone else, temporarily at least, and also agreed to lower their dues again, right? But it weakened Local 8, and I would suggest it weakened the IWW too, and it's complicated. And I don't know I've looked, including after the Communist Party opened some of its records that are at the Library of Congress, and really found zero, right? Like, so it'd be curious to know if the communists ordered this, and the answer is I never found any evidence they did. I can believe it, but I can't substantiate it. But Ben Fletcher and others claimed it. They were there and I wasn't, right? Like, and so I also am inclined to believe them when they say that this was a false flag, you might say. But it definitely weakened the institution, and it weakened Local 8. Yeah, and it didn't have any positive outcome.
So what ultimately happened to Local 8 and Fletcher?
Yeah, well, I'll try to be brief. So Fletcher's in prison, right? Like, he, like E.F. Doree, Walter Neff, Manuel Ray, and Jack Walsh, 5 Philadelphia-based Wobblies, were in Leavenworth for different periods of time. They were sentenced to 10 years to 20 years, right? Like, they get out in the early 20s, right, and have their sentences later commuted by FDR. If you are arrested again, your sentence could be reinstituted and you can be sent back to federal prison. Nevertheless, Fletcher and Walsh continued to support the IWW and were involved in the big 1922 strike and subsequent efforts to reorganize the waterfront after losing it to the ILA in 1922-23. But in 1922, there was a big strike happened in November of 22. That's just before winter, before climate change, right? Philadelphia was really cold. The ships would actually stop running up the Delaware River, right? For much of the winter. And so basically you had no work, right? You had higher expenses because you had to pay for coal to heat your apartments, right? And so the timing of the strike was bad, right? Employers lock out actually the workers. It becomes workers are claiming they want an 8-hour day, but employers basically preemptively lock out. They start then appealing to workers of different ethnic and racial groups to come back, right? The divide and conquer strategy. That's somewhat effective because a lot of the newer African-American members from the South had less experience in the IWW. But also the leadership was weaker. The Wobblies were weaker. The AFL is sort of advocating that the ILA should sort of represent the Dockworkers. That doesn't officially happen until 1927, 5 years later. Basically, Local 8 loses that strike / lockout and no longer is able to effectively represent the workers on the waterfront. And they go through a period of not having a union. ILA gets basically control of the union in 27 by delivering an 8-hour day, because really the federal government put its weight behind the ILA, because the head of what was called the U.S. Shipping Board, which was this World War I era federal agency that was later ended, right? Basically pressured employers to accept the 8-hour day in their contracts. And then the members or the workers in Philadelphia voted for the ILA. The shape-up had returned, and it remained in force until the 50s or 60s. And so the ILA, despite being a union, refused to fight to get rid of the shape. The gangs had been resegregated, and that also remained in effect until the 60s or even early 70s in Philadelphia. And so although the union existed and they might have earned more money and had better hours, racial divisions were resown, but also workers were weaker, and the ILA is notoriously anti-democratic. And so they didn't have fair elections. They didn't have open meetings. They didn't ever produce a newspaper for their members. It's internally, to this day, I would suggest the ILA is still very problematic. But there's still a dockworker union in Philadelphia, although it's a much smaller port in the era of containers and bigger ships. No one really sails up the Delaware, right? There's a few hundred members, I think, in Local 1291. And so that's 1927. This 1291 has been around for actually almost 100 years now. Fletcher later moves to New York City around 1930. Has a lot of health issues. Has a bad stroke in the mid 30s, in his mid 40s. So very young to have a stroke. He's married. It was his second wife. His first wife was white. His second wife was black. She was a nurse, maybe, and probably the breadwinner for many years. They lived in Brooklyn in a neighborhood called Bedford-Stuyvesant, which became predominantly black, but was not predominantly black in the interwar era. And other Wobblies from Philly also ended up in that neighborhood, including the Neffs. Walter Neff was another leader, including the E.F. Dorey's widow and her children. E.F. Dorey died in the late 20s at a very young age, and including the famous Jewish Wobbly anarchist Sam Dolgoff and his wife Esther, right, who became very good friends with Ben Fletcher, right? And so this little radical milieu in Bed-Stuy, and Fletcher died in 49, is buried in an unmarked grave in Evergreen Cemetery, which is just to the east of Bedford-Stuyvesant. Although he had siblings and family, mostly still in the Philadelphia area, but also some in the New York area.
Did he have any children? Fletcher
never had children, as far as we know. I'm actually pretty sure he doesn't have children, but I guess it's not definite, right? To my knowledge, no children. I'm in touch with loosely a great nephew, who was born and raised in Philadelphia, and who was in the Black Panthers in the early 70s, and later imprisoned for reasons I do not know, and lives in Pittsburgh. but and is very proud of, and apparently the family is sort of divided based on maybe their politics on whether to be proud of or dislike or ashamed of, I don't know, Ben Fletcher, right?
Well, there's our next interview episode, Gabe.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I did also want to bring up the way that you and I met, Dr. Cole, and talk about the long ongoing mural project.
Yeah, so just briefly, a couple years ago, members of the Philadelphia chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America contacted me, their Racial Justice Committee, and said they learned of the history of Local 8 and Ben Fletcher and wanted to do something about that, and suggested creating a historical sign worth the state of Pennsylvania's historical commission. And I said, that's a great idea. I'd be very happy to help. We should bring in the Philadelphia IWW. But I also suggested that, we should do something in addition to that and take advantage of the city mural art program to get a mural if we could, because I'm a huge fan and active in Chicago and some public art initiatives. And it just so happened there was a member of the DSA Racial Justice Committee who worked at that time for mural arts, and to my surprise didn't immediately jump on that idea before me, but then immediately was like, let's do this. And so we applied for and had the sign accepted. The Philly IWW actually paid for that sign, which will be installed, I think, this fall near the Delaware River. The mural was also accepted, our application, and that program pays for the mural, pays the artist, pays for all the expenses, right, as well as securing a building, which, as Gabe knows, is going to be 300 South Columbus, right, a city-owned building, and the marker will be near there, and the Delaware River and the Independent Seaport Museum. And the artist is a Native African-American, Native Philadelphian and African-American named Jonathan Pinkett, who's a fellow at the Barnes Foundation, is a prominent painter, especially of portraits, right? So he's designed the work, and it's in the process of being basically painted and then will be installed. They don't paint it on the building, they paint it offsite, and then basically put it up right on the building. Will that happen in the fall of 2023? We had been told yes, and now we are sort of on deck. We shall see. It'll happen, but if it happens in the fall of 23, at this point I'll be pleasantly surprised. And if it happens in the spring of 24, I'll be less surprised. Maybe I had suggested May Day 2023 as sort of the unveiling, but it might be May Day 24, right? I don't know what day of the week that is. So actually, it'll probably be on a Saturday because we want maximum attendance, and I will fly happily to Philadelphia to attend the unveiling that the DSA and the IWW will help co-organize. I see May 1st, 2024 is a Wednesday.
Well, we'll go for, I guess, the 4th.
Right, Kent State.
Well, thank you again for joining us. And do you want to plug both of your books again?
Oh, well, it's my pleasure. So my book was called Wobblies on the Waterfront, Interracial Unionism in Progressive Era Philadelphia. That was University of Illinois Press. And then I published a book called Ben Fletcher, The Life and Times of a Black Wobbly, that originally was published by Charles Kerr, hard to find. But then I had the opportunity to basically do a second edition with PM Press, which came out in 2021. And that book is twice as long and has a totally revised introduction. And so, like the original version is cool and I'm proud of it. The newer edition is better, right? And much more easy to acquire, right? So I suppose Wooden Shoe carries both, but you can get it at bookshop.org, or you can go directly to the publisher's websites to purchase those. I didn't mention, but Wobblies of the World, A Global History of the IWW, which I co-edited on Pluto Press, is a great anthology that has 20 authors writing about the IWW worldwide. That really explores the issue of, it's the first attempt to really do not the history of the IWW globally, but a history, because it's doesn't pretend or can't. But the IWW has, existed in many places and times in many languages, and there's no single historian has the language abilities to really have done that book. And so Wobblies of the World is also a really wonderful book, in my opinion. Of course, I think so. But your listeners would also appreciate, of course.
I think they will.
Yeah, or what everyone should do is go to their local public libraries and request that they acquire these books so that then they can be read by more than one person.
Or if you want to purchase it, go to friend of the show, Wooden Shoe.
Yes.
Yeah.
All the better.
And if you're ordering from bookshop.org, you can list Wooden Shoe as the recipient of the donation.
Nice.
Thank you for telling me that.
And of course, and I also realized I'm a terrible co-host. So Sam, do you have any questions? Now that I've monopolized this entire thing.
No.
He asked a few.
Can I have a closing statement?
Of course.
It's not a statement. It's just quoting Peter. Just in honor of Ben Fletcher, what you said, organizing is not always sexy or is not sexy. I forget what you said, but it's true. It's very technical, and it's. I have a great respect for people who actually can do that. I don't think I could do that. I'm an entertainer. I'm not an educator. So.
Yeah, it's Fletcher was well respected and frequently praised for his speaking abilities, his humor, right, which is one of the great ways to sort of basically disarm and sort of appeal to people, as well as a writer, right? Yes, and he did the hard work. And sometimes I do wonder, what if he wasn't sick, right, in the 30s? What might he have done?
Sure. Yeah.
But those are sort of those tantalizing counterfactual or hypotheticals that we could talk about over a drink sometime.
Well, we'll look forward to talking about that in May of 24.
Bingo.
Well, thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thank you very much to the two of you and for doing this show, which actually is a form of organizing.
Aww. We'll end with that.